came to think of as Protestant, for changes in the art and architecture of the physical structures which would remove distractive elements and make them more accessible to communal involvement. They also advocated the inclusion of popular music in liturgy, and they were confident that if these modifications were embraced by everyone, the Catholic Church would be renewed. The other side, supported by Dom Guéranger and subsequently by Dom Baudouin, until his incursion into an ecumenical experiment, pushed for a return to the sacred, to the great liturgical era of the Middle Ages. They were certain that the faithful would most benefit from the beauty, pageantry, splendor, mystery, and intense piety of the traditional liturgy. One could say that there was a third party in all of this, the undecided, those priests, monks, and theologians who had not yet chosen sides but continued to exercise their respective ministries to the best of their abilities. These were fair game for whomever in the other two camps might be able to forward the most convincing argument. As the 20th century dawned, that was the situation, and although the first pope to be elected in the 20th century clearly fell on the side of Dom Guéranger, the papacy of Pope St. Pius X would serve to be a turning point in the liturgical wars. Within 3 months of his election in 1903, St. Pius X issued a motu proprio tra le sollecitudini to address many of these very issues. The great Pope condemned the introduction of profane music in the liturgy and the individual abuses that were becoming more and more widespread. He called for the removal of banal art which had become commonplace in the churches, and ordered the return of beauty in both art and architecture which would reflect authentic Catholic thought. He then called on the bishops to bring the faithful in their care to an understanding and proper appreciation of the sacred music of the Church, particularly the ancient chant, that in this way they might more thoroughly embrace the liturgy to the depths of their being. The sainted Pope wanted nothing more than sacred liturgy that would positively affect the faithful in their pews. So, who won this battle between the progressivists and the traditionalists? But how did it happen? How did they overcome their traditional opponents when, to all appearances, those who supported the traditional position were in power? The first thing that occurred, which began to tip the scales, was the hijacking of St. Pius X's motu proprio on the liturgy. Whereas he specifically called for a participation of the faithful in traditional plain chant, which he was convinced would enable them to more thoroughly embrace the beauty and mystery of the sacred liturgy, the progressivists co-opted his intent and misrepresented his words in a way which falsely represents that the Pope wished for a participation by the faithful that was active, as in physical involvement. Certainly this was neither what the Pope said nor what he meant. The misrepresentation of the Pope's remarks, which the progressivists then claimed was a call to active participation in the liturgy by all the faithful, was a clever blow, and one from which the Church continues to reel today, almost 100 years later. For it is in the name of active participation that the bulk of the changes promoted and experimented with for over 300 years have been incorporated into Catholic liturgy in the new Mass. I don't wish to belabor the point, but there is one aspect of the matter of participation which turns out to be the leading issue. Call it the point man in this charge to change the liturgy. That is the introduction of the layman's missal, which set the stage during the pontificate of St. Pius X for the innovative and experimental dialogue Mass, the first giant step toward Pope Paul VI's Mass. The dialogue Mass was introduced illicitly prior to World War I and spread throughout Europe and subsequently to the United States because it was immediately adapted by the military chaplains. The same technique would be used throughout the 20th century to attempt to force acceptance to other illicit practices. Communion in the hand, communion under both species, and altar girls are just some familiar examples. In the early years of the 20th century, progressivists proposed, as had the Jansenists, Rosmini, and virtually every other liturgical progressivist, that if the faithful had access to a missal, the Mass would become more meaningful. And recall, the translation of the Mass into vernacular had been prohibited by the Church, a condemnation with the strongest censures attached until 1877. Would the introduction of a layman's missal and ultimately the dialogue Mass do what the progressivists proposed? Certainly the Church had never believed it would. St. Leonard of Port Maurice, the great Franciscan preacher who brought tens of thousands of Calvinists back into the Church, wrote extensively on the Mass. In The Hidden Treasure, Holy Mass, St. Leonard defines three basic levels of assisting at Mass, beginning with what he perceives as the least effective. The first method of hearing Holy Mass is used by those who, book in hand, accompany with the utmost attention all the actions of the priest, and thus pass the whole of the Mass reading. The second method of hearing Holy Mass is that employed by those who dispense with books, who read nothing whatsoever during the time of the divine sacrifice, but fixing their mental eye, kindled by faith on Jesus crucified, and leaning against the tree of the cross, gather its fruits in sweet contemplation, pass the whole of the time in devout interior recollection, and sweetly engage their minds in consideration of those mysteries of the Passion of Jesus which are not only represented, but are mystically carried out in that holy sacrifice. There is no doubt that this mode of hearing Mass is much more profitable than the first, as well as more sweet and attractive. The third method St. Leonard proposes is a combination of the two above, which uses some read prayers, although not those of the Missal, but prayers specific to the four ends of prayer, that is, praise, contrition, petition, and thanksgiving. St. Peter Julian Eymard, who lived in the 19th century and was known as the Apostle of the Eucharist, proposed several methods of hearing Mass which he considered superlative. None involved the use of a Missal. And recall Bishop John England, who published the first American Missal. In his defense of the Latin language, he points out, the Mass is not a common prayer, but an act of sacrifice, in which by the ministry of the priest, God does acts beneficial to the people. In other words, prior to 1877, the Church had officially forbidden the use of layman's missals, and many saints throughout the life of the Church certainly provided a great deal of insight into ways through which the faithful might most effectively participate in the Mass, and it was not through the use of a Missal. Why then, and not only from the progressivists, but even from those who followed in the footsteps of Guéranger, was there such a push for vernacular missals to be made use of at every Mass? It is an interesting question, and even more so is it interesting because the demand for the use of the Missal at Mass by every layman is about the only issue on which the progressivists and traditionalists agreed. You don't suppose that the use of the Missal by laymen at Mass might have been considered a stepping stone to something else, do you? Let me say that it is tempting at this point to provide a great deal more detailed historical information on liturgical movement. But for our purposes here, there's far more information than there is time to complete this video. And let's face it, most of the individuals who form the core of the liturgical movement over the past 2 centuries, and particularly in the 20th century, are people whose names are unfamiliar to all but those who have intense interest in matters liturgical.